In the spring of 2013, what seemed to be a straightforward emergency call-out for 2 police officers would turn out to be anything but. Not only would this experience chill them to the core, it would have them questioning their own reality for years afterwards, as they tried to solve the riddle that was the Crosswayed interlopers. The pitch of the engine climbed higher as the vehicle picked up speed, racing along dark country roads that would have been as black as pitch, if not for the high beams illuminating the trees and hedgerows around them. James Haverland, who was sat in the front passenger seat, had briefly considered switching on the blues and blaring the sirens, but decided there was little point. The roads were empty, and there wasn't another vehicle for miles around. It was 2:21 a.m. on the 31st of March, 2013, and James and his on-duty partner, Chris Braddock, who was driving, had just received a call from the CCR, or Contact and Control Room, about a possible break-in at a remote facility out in the countryside. They were in a rural area on the outskirts of Whitehaven, a town situated in the Copeland district of Cumbria, England, about 3 miles from their intended destination. They would be on scene within minutes, although neither man could have known at that moment in time that this call would challenge their very understanding of reality, and change their lives forever. The facility they were heading towards was owned by Crossway Enterprises, and was known locally as something of an oddity. Its modern architecture stood out like a sore thumb against the otherwise beautiful and unspoiled English countryside that surrounded it. The amount of technology it boasted was also at odds with its rural setting, a highly advanced security framework, remote access and lighting control, and the latest building management systems and head-end software suites, all housed within what is otherwise known in the industry as a smart building. Its quiet and remote location was the last place you would expect to see such a thing. Nevertheless, the building stood in silence as they arrived. Shrouded in an eerie darkness that made it seem all the more out of place, the facility looked deserted, no internal lights were switched on, and there was certainly no sign of a break-in. The call had come through, stating that the alarm had been going off intermittently, and that some of the PIR, or passive infrared sensors, had picked up on heat signatures within the building itself. This information had been provided by the facility's manager, who was off-site, but had remote access to the building's security systems. Even so, the relative calm of the scene in front of them made Chris and James feel hesitant. They parked across the road and sat in silence for a moment, observant, waiting for any kind of movement or indication of criminal activity. At one point, James thought he saw a flash of light through one of the ground floor windows, but reasoned that it could have been a sensor or smoke alarm, or indeed, just his imagination. Over the next few minutes, nothing at all happened. They could hear the muffled sound of wind blowing around the exterior of the vehicle, and the leaves rustling in the breeze, which was somehow both peaceful and slightly unsettling all at the same time, but there was no sign of anything untoward. However, their attention was soon drawn to the lobby, when he and Chris both witnessed the light flicker on, and illuminate the space inside. Suddenly, the automatic doors at the front of the building opened and shut on their own, before the alarm started to sound, piercing the air with a high-pitched undulating screech. Although startled, both men believed that they had the measure of the situation, that the access system was malfunctioning, and that the opening and closing doors was breaking the live circuit and setting off the alarm. But just as they were about to radio back to the CCR, a figure emerged from the front entrance, then appeared to look over towards their police car, before jogging off to the right, around to the rear of the building. Just seconds later, another, much taller figure emerged, but headed round to the left instead. In normal circumstances, James and Chris would have jumped out of their vehicle and scrambled after the 2 men, but something had given them pause. Although the figures had been distant, and only silhouettes cast against the light coming from the lobby, there was no mistaking what they were. They could tell by the shapes of the caps and bulky stab vests, that these 2 figures had, in fact, been police officers. Chris scanned the scene for another police vehicle, whilst James radioed back to dispatch, asking if there was another unit on scene. The reply came back negative. Chris and James were apparently the only ones there. The only other explanation was that the other 2 men were security guards. But the 2 police officers had been under the impression that the facility had no on-site security. After all, it was in the middle of nowhere, something was obviously not quite right with this picture, and whilst the situation was becoming confusing, things were about to turn extremely weird. Just as James finished using the radio, both figures walked back around to the front of the building, and stood outside the entrance looking confused. The taller one of the two appeared to kick a pebble on the ground, which might have seemed like an insignificant action at the time, but would later prove to be pivotal in realizing the truth of the matter. There was something oddly familiar about these two men. And both Chris and James were sure they must have known them. There was something in the way they moved and carried themselves that reminded them of someone they knew, but they could not put their finger on exactly who it was. Suddenly, both figures looked over towards the police car, and began to run towards it. Chris and James stepped out of their vehicle, and donned their caps, ready to greet them, but when they looked up, the security guards, or police officers, or whatever they were, had disappeared. All that stood before Chris and James was the dark Crossway building. The lights had all turned off again, and the alarm was no longer sounding. Both police officers looked left and right. They were in a wide-open car park. There was nowhere else these two other men could have gone. They had simply vanished into thin air. They looked at each other in stunned silence, neither man willing to speak first about what they had just witnessed. Time seemed to stand still, the wind was no longer blowing, the leaves no longer rustling. The air had become thick and heavy, as if muffled and weighted down by an inevitability that neither man was aware of at that moment in time. After their initial shock had subsided, James was the first to say something, and suggested that they go over and take a look at the building. Chris agreed, but there was no denying that both men felt a stab of apprehension as they made their way over the road. They noticed as they approached the front entrance that it was completely locked down. They had to relay a request to the facilities manager in order to gain access. As they entered the lobby, Chris went up the flight of stairs to the first floor, whilst James remained on the ground floor and began checking through the dark offices as the lighting system had still not activated. He found nothing out of the ordinary, but couldn't help feeling a little spooked about what had happened only moments before. As he was walking back towards the lobby, he noticed the light flicker on. Then he heard the hiss of the automatic doors as they opened and closed, before the silence was suddenly shattered once again by the sound of the alarm. He picked up the pace and noticed Chris coming down the stairs as he exited the building, fully believing that an intruder had just slipped past them. He looked over towards their vehicle and quickly scanned the car park for anyone running away, but there was no one there. His instincts told him to run around to the left of the building as it was the quickest way for someone to get out of sight. However, as he made his way around to the rear, he was confronted with a refuse area, which was surrounded by high brick walls. He checked the bins inside and out, and even tried to scale the wall itself, but it was just too high. There was no chance someone could have escaped this way. Returning to the front of the building, he noticed Chris walking back from the other side, and they met up in front of the entrance. Not for the first time that night, they were completely baffled by what had just happened, and contemplated radioing back to the CCR to tell them that the access and alarm systems were malfunctioning, and would need to be checked over. They were reluctant to put it all down to a false alarm, as they knew they had witnessed two other people on the scene, although they would have had trouble in explaining in their reports exactly who those people were. Or indeed, where they had gone. It was only when Chris, James' well-built, 6 feet 6 inches tall partner, casually kicked a pebble on the ground in front of the building, whilst discussing their options, that the reality of the situation came crashing down. But it couldn't be. Surely. They looked back towards their vehicle, and sure enough, they saw two faces staring out at them from behind the windscreen. The dash lights were reflecting off their skin, and they knew in that instant that those two faces were their own. They ran back towards their car, and saw the doors open, but no one stepped out. The two men inside had vanished. James has spent the last 4 years pondering on exactly what happened in the early hours of that morning. Before this, he had never experienced anything he would describe as paranormal or supernatural. He was an ardent sceptic, and in most cases still is, but he has no rational explanation for what occurred. He has researched online, and has spoken to many so-called experts, but usually finds that they have more questions than they do answers. Neither he nor Chris are certain what they experienced, whether they saw their own doppelgangers, or whether it was a glitch in reality, where the universe slipped time, and allowed them a brief glimpse into their own futures, or maybe that they even both temporarily lost their minds. They are well aware of how unbelievable this sounds, and for this reason. They did not write it up in any of their reports. Names and details have had to be changed in order for us to share this story with you. There is no such company as Crossway Enterprises, but somewhere out in the wilds of Cumbria, there is a building which stands alone, and in stark contrast to its surroundings. A building which sends a very real chill up the spines of at least 2 police officers. Whenever they think back on the events of that early morning, all those years ago,